we look at the Sphinx today that's hiding, this is what the ancient Egyptian in the late period thought the same. Then they came and they began to dig to find out what's hidden under the Sphinx.
For more than 4,000 years, the Great Sphinx of Giza has stood in absolute silence, staring eastward across the desert sands with that unmistakable expression carved into ancient limestone. Millions of people have walked past it, photographed it, and studied it. Scholars have written entire careers' worth of books about it. And yet, beneath that weathered stone surface, something has always waited. Something that the world's most powerful archaeologists spent decades trying to explain, and ultimately admitted he could not fully describe using the language of modern science. This is not a story about treasure. It is not a story about a hidden tomb filled with golden artifacts. What was found beneath the Sphinx is something far stranger, far more difficult to categorize, and far more unsettling than anything a typical archaeology documentary would ever dare to suggest. To understand the full weight of what was discovered, you first need to understand the man at the center of this story. Zahi Hawass was not simply an archaeologist. For nearly 4 decades, he was the gatekeeper of Egypt's most sacred historical ground. He controlled access to the pyramids, the temples, the burial chambers, and the Sphinx itself. If a foreign research team wanted to excavate anywhere on the Giza Plateau, they needed his permission. If a documentary filmmaker wanted to film inside a pharaoh's tomb, Hawass decided whether the cameras would be allowed in. He appeared on television programs watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world, and in every single appearance, his message about the Sphinx was identical. There were no hidden chambers. There was no secret history. The monument was built for the pharaoh Khafre. It served as a symbol of royal authority, and its mysteries were already fully understood. He repeated this position with absolute confidence for decades, and because of the enormous power he held over Egyptian archaeology, the world believed him. But the story that was unfolding behind closed doors was completely different from the one he was sharing with the public. And the earliest signs of that hidden story appeared not in an excavation trench or a dramatic discovery, but in the quiet results of an engineering survey carried out decades ago. Back in the 1970s, a team of engineers was brought to the Sphinx for a very practical reason. The monument is incredibly ancient, and after thousands of years of exposure to desert winds, sand, and fluctuating temperatures, there were legitimate concerns about the structural integrity of the limestone. To study what was happening beneath the surface, without physically tearing the monument apart, the engineers used acoustic scanning technology. The method works by sending sound waves into ground and recording how those waves travel and bounce back. Different materials return different signals, and by analyzing the patterns, scientists can build a detailed picture of what lies below without ever lifting a single stone. The team expected to find exactly what common sense would suggest they would find. Solid limestone, natural bedrock, the same continuous rock that forms the entire Giza Plateau. What the machines actually recorded stopped the engineers cold. Instead of the expected uniform rock signature, the scanning equipment detected hollow spaces. Not just one small anomaly, but multiple distinct areas where the sound waves were behaving as though they had encountered empty chambers beneath the monument. The engineers noted the findings, filed their reports, and moved on. The official response was calm. The Giza area is riddled with ancient burial shafts and forgotten tombs. Hollow spaces beneath the desert floor are not unusual in that region. The conclusion offered to the public was simple and reasonable. These were probably undiscovered burial chambers. Nothing more. The mystery, it seemed, had already been solved before it truly had a chance to begin. But then the technology improved. Years later, researchers returned to the Sphinx armed with far more sophisticated instruments, including ground-penetrating radar systems capable of producing detailed underground maps with a level of precision that the earlier acoustic equipment could never have achieved. And when those new machines were pointed at the ground beneath the ancient statue, what they revealed fundamentally changed the nature of the question being asked. The hollow spaces were still there, but this time, the images were clear enough to reveal something the earlier scans had been unable to show. The cavities were not randomly distributed beneath the monument the way naturally formed voids or casually dug burial shafts would be. They were arranged in a pattern with a symmetry so precise it seemed almost impossible to explain away as natural geology. A large cavity on the northern side of the Sphinx appeared to have a near-perfect mirror counterpart on the southern side. The shapes corresponded to each other with remarkable accuracy, as though they had been deliberately designed to balance each other. Natural rock formations do not behave this way. Even the most carefully constructed ancient Egyptian tombs were not designed with this kind of hidden geometric precision beneath a massive monument. The engineers and researchers who studied these images were looking at something that did not fit any known category of ancient construction, and it was sitting directly under one of the most famous statues on Earth. This is the point at which Zahi Hawass enters the story in a much more active and complicated role. During a major conservation effort on the Sphinx in the late 1980s, Hawass personally oversaw a series of drilling operations that went far deeper than anything that would have been required for simple surface preservation work. Specialized equipment was brought onto the Giza Plateau, and narrow cylindrical holes were bored directly into the ancient limestone at carefully chosen locations around the monument. Through these holes, the drilling equipment extracted long, thin cores of rock, cylinders of stone pulled from deep beneath the surface. The stated purpose was structural analysis. Scientists needed to understand how the limestone layers were holding up, which parts of the rock were weakening, and where repairs would be most urgently needed. But the exact locations where those holes were drilled tell a completely different story. When researchers later compared the drilling coordinates with the results of the ground-penetrating radar surveys, the match was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The drill sites had been positioned at precisely the locations where the radar scans had detected the mysterious symmetrical cavities. Not near those locations, not roughly in that area, but exactly there. While Hawass was publicly declaring to anyone who would listen that nothing unusual existed beneath the Sphinx, his own team was quietly boring holes into the exact spots where the underground anomalies had been found. The official report that followed stated that the core samples contained nothing unusual. Normal limestone, standard geology, case closed, and yet the drilling itself had given Hawass something no other researcher on Earth possessed at that moment. Physical samples of rock extracted from the very boundary of those unknown spaces. Small cylinders of stone taken from the edge of whatever was down there. Those samples sat in storage for years. But science has a way of returning to old evidence with new tools. And when researchers eventually had the opportunity to examine those same core samples using modern microscopic analysis technology, what they found in the limestone created an entirely new layer of mystery. Quartz crystals are extremely common in limestone. Their presence in rock samples from the Giza Plateau would normally be considered completely unremarkable, barely worth noting in a research paper. But the quartz crystals found in the samples extracted from beneath the Sphinx were not behaving the way quartz crystals are supposed to behave. In natural stone, quartz forms in random orientations. Each crystal grows independently, pointing in whatever direction local conditions happen to favor at the time of its formation. The result is a random, chaotic distribution of crystal alignments that is essentially the geological fingerprint of undisturbed natural rock. The crystals in these particular samples were not randomly oriented. They were aligned, not partially, not approximately, but with consistency that researchers found deeply difficult to explain. Nearly all of the tiny crystals were pointing in the same direction, arranged along a single axis, as though some powerful force had reached into the stone and rotated every individual crystal into the same position before locking them there permanently. The only known processes that can create this kind of crystal alignment in modern laboratory settings involve exposure to extremely intense directional energy. Powerful high-frequency vibration falls into this category. So does focused acoustic energy operating at frequencies far beyond anything the human ear can detect. The stone itself appeared to carry the signature of something that had generated enormous focused energy at some point in its ancient history, and that energy had left its mark in the microscopic structure of the rock in a way that thousands of years of desert time have been unable to erase. While scientists were grappling with what this crystal alignment actually meant, another team was looking at the surface of the Sphinx itself and coming to equally uncomfortable conclusions. The official explanation for the damage and weathering visible on the monument had always been straightforward. Desert wind carrying sand had slowly abraded the limestone surface over thousands of years. This is a perfectly reasonable mechanism for stone erosion in an arid environment, and for a long time it satisfied most scholars. But independent geologists who examined the weathering patterns up close began to notice something that directly contradicted this explanation. Across the body of the Sphinx and along the walls of the deep enclosure surrounding it, they found deep vertical grooves cut into the limestone surface. These channels ran from top to bottom in long, continuous lines, and their shape and orientation were completely inconsistent with wind erosion. Wind erosion creates horizontal marks. When sand-carrying air moves sideways across a stone surface, it leaves horizontal wave patterns and smooth lateral curves. But the grooves on the Sphinx were not horizontal. They were vertical, running from the top of the stone surfaces straight down to the ground. Geologists recognize this pattern immediately because it appears in a very specific set of circumstances. Vertical channels like these are the signature of prolonged water erosion, specifically the kind produced when heavy rainfall repeatedly strikes a stone surface and flows downward over hundreds or thousands of years. The implications of this observation created a serious problem for the accepted timeline of ancient Egyptian history. The Giza region has been essentially desert for the last 5,000 years. Rainfall does occur, but it is infrequent and light, nowhere near sufficient to carve the kind of deep vertical channels visible on the Sphinx's body. For that level of water erosion to have occurred, the monument would need to have been exposed to a dramatically wetter climate. And the last time the region around Giza experienced consistently heavy rainfall was thousands of years before the traditional construction date assigned to the Sphinx. At the same time that scientists were working through these geological questions, other researchers were examining ancient texts and local historical traditions connected to the monument. What they found in these old records added yet another dimension to the growing mystery. The ancient descriptions of the Sphinx that have survived in historical sources do not consistently describe the monument the way modern archaeology describes it. While many texts discuss the Sphinx in the context of royal power and religious symbolism, others use strikingly different language. Some of the oldest references describe the space beneath the monument in functional terms, language that suggests the structure may have had an active purpose rather than simply being a decorative monument connected to a pharaoh's burial complex. Phrases that translate roughly as a regulating chamber or references to the monument as something connected to the living forces of the land appear in sources that most historians have simply set aside as metaphorical or mythological. But when these descriptions are placed alongside the physical evidence from the underground scans and the core sample analysis, the metaphorical explanation begins to seem less satisfying. Then came the discovery that transformed the entire scope of the investigation. When researchers using the most advanced ground-penetrating radar systems available returned to the Sphinx for a comprehensive new survey, they confirmed the presence of the symmetrical underground cavities. But the updated scans also revealed something that none of the earlier investigations had detected. The cavities were not isolated. They were connected to each other by narrow, dense structures running between them. On the radar imaging, these connecting structures appeared as tight, regular pathways linking one cavity to another in a configuration that researchers struggle to describe without reaching for technological metaphors. The patterns resembled the internal wiring of a complex electronic system far more than they resembled anything produced by natural geological processes or ancient tomb construction. And then the scans continued outward beyond the body of the Sphinx itself. Beneath the desert sands of the Giza Plateau, the pathways did not end. They extended outward in straight lines, continuing across the plateau in the direction of the Great Pyramids standing nearby, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest and most precisely constructed ancient building on Earth. The picture that emerged from this data was no longer about a single hidden chamber beneath one ancient statue. Researchers were now looking at the possibility of an interconnected underground system linking the most famous monuments in the ancient world to each other, through a network of structures buried beneath the desert that no living human being has ever seen. It was in the context of all this evidence that Hawass, speaking privately to a small group of trusted colleagues away from any cameras or press coverage, made the admission that has quietly circulated among researchers ever since. He did not confess to covering up a chamber full of artifacts. He did not describe a secret room beneath the Sphinx containing evidence of a lost civilization. What he said was stranger and in some ways more significant. He explained that his greatest mistake was attempting to describe a modern discovery using ancient conceptual frameworks that were simply inadequate to the task. The thing that had been encountered beneath the Sphinx could not be properly explained using the vocabulary that archaeology had developed to describe tombs, temples, and monuments. The tools of his professional discipline were not built to handle whatever this was. That single admission, quiet and unbroadcast, raises every question that the official story had spent decades trying to close. If there was nothing unusual beneath the Sphinx, there would be nothing to struggle to describe. If the underground spaces were simply empty burial chambers of the kind found throughout the Giza region, an experienced archaeologist with 40 years of expertise would have no trouble categorizing them. The difficulty only arises when the thing being described falls outside every known category. And that is precisely what Hawass appears to have been saying in that room. Something had been found. Something real. Something physical. Something that left measurable signatures in stone and detectable patterns in the rock. And the greatest Egyptologist of his generation, the man who controlled access to that ground for 4 decades, stood before a small group of colleagues and admitted that he did not have a language to explain it. The Great Sphinx of Giza continues to stand exactly where it has always stood, staring east across the desert in the early morning light, just as it was doing when the first pharaohs built their monuments around it. The sand still drifts against its ancient flanks. Tourists still photograph its damaged face from the viewing platform below. And beneath it, whatever was built or formed or placed in that limestone, whatever produced those symmetrical cavities and those crystal alignments and those outward-reaching underground pathways, continues to wait. The questions it raises are not small ones. They reach into the foundations of everything historians believe about the origins of human civilization, the capabilities of the ancient world, and the true purpose of the most famous collection of monuments ever constructed. And those questions, for now, remain exactly as unanswered as the expression on that ancient stone face looking out across the Egyptian dawn.